And in the next 20 to 25 minutes, I would like to talk about one special work of a certain composer. And this composer was persecuted during and after the Holocaust. And furthermore, I would also like to talk about cultural memory and forgetting. And therefore, the title of my presentation is "We Must Never Forget: Coming to Terms with Trauma Caused by War Crimes in the Music Theater, The Passenger." The opera The Passenger from the composer Mieczysław Weinberg is of course not as famous as La Bohème or Carmen. Some of you may also not have seen the opera yet. It is an opera that deals with the atrocities of the Second World War, the Holocaust. The opening phrase of my title, "We Must Never Forget," can be seen as the general message of the opera. And these are also the words from Sophia Pozmich. And Sophia Pozmich was a Polish author whose novel Pasacherka served as a model for the libretto of Weinberg's opera. Some biographical information about the author herself. She was just 18 years old when the Nazi terror began, and Pozmich came into contact with an underground press and distributed forbidden leaflets, and for this reason she was arrested in 1942 and sent to the Auschwitz concentration camp. Of course with one S, not double S. Thanks to her knowledge of German, she became a B detainee and regained some hope. And as a B detainee, you get, for example, more food than the other inmates. She also met a Polish officer named Tadeusz, and however, he was murdered a few months later in the concentration camp. Tadeusz also played a major role in the opera. In 1955, the Allies liberated the camp, and Pozmich was one of the 19 survivors of Auschwitz. Understandably, at first she wanted to suppress and forget her traumatic experiences, but a striking meeting in Paris, however, led her to turn them into a radio play and then into a novel in 1962. I quote, "After landing, I had a few hours off and walked immediately to the Place de la Concorde. There were many tourists, including a German group. Suddenly, I hear the female voice. 'Erika, where are you? Come here, we're leaving.' Startled, I turned around. That was the voice of my supervisor, Franz, a sharp, high-pitched voice. Of course, she was not, but the similarity of the voices was striking. I could not free myself from this turmoil. At home, I told my husband about it. What would I have done if it had been her?" Pozmich decided to confront her past, and it is remarkable that she tells the story, which has many similarities with her own biography, from the point of view of Lise, a concentration camp guard. Lise is also the main character of the book and also of Weinberg's opera. And I would like to give you a brief summary of the content of the opera in 2 acts, whose libretto was written by Alexander Medvedev. I'm also including some strong sentences with political messages. So 15 years after the end of the war, Lise travels with her husband Walter on the ship to South America. And during the journey, Lise is struck by the appearance of a passenger she sees. And the passenger reminds her of an inmate in Auschwitz who was under her orders and who she knows for certain is dead. In shock, she reveals her past to her husband and she explains to him, "But don't you imagine that I took part in all the brutal horrors of Auschwitz? I never took part in beating anyone." The story continues with a flashback to the concentration camp. The guard Lise decides to make Martha her confidant because the guards need to find one amongst each group of inmates who can be manipulated to lead the others easily. Lise expects gratitude from Martha in return, but Martha wants to remain loyal to her friends. And because of that, Lise complains about this to her husband. "How they hated us, Walter. All of us who served in the camp couldn't get used to it." So the relationship between Martha and Lise is very delicate, and Lise increasingly offers Martha favors, such as arranging a rendezvous with her fiancé Tadeusz, who is also imprisoned. But instead of gratitude or even kind of friendship, she receives rejection. And when Lise learns about the forbidden contact between the lovers Martha and Tadeusz, she reports it and reveals her punishment to Martha. My report is written. You will be sent to the block. Yes, that one. You know what I mean. Back in the present on a ship, Lise justifies her past in similar terms as before. All right, I was in Auschwitz, but that doesn't mean that therefore I'm a criminal. I was a honorable German. I'm proud. I'm proud of my past. Her husband confirms it. It was the war, and many years have passed. We all have the right to forget the past. The climax of the opera is the scene with Tadeusz, who is already condemned to death and is forced to play the commander's favorite waltz before he will die. Instead, he plays Bach's Chaconne, and I will explain a little bit more about this scene soon. In the epilogue, at the end of the opera, the stage belongs to Martha, and she sings that the dead should never be forgotten and they can never forgive. So why did the composer turn the Polish novel into an opera? First and foremost, certainly because of Weinberg's own past. According to the Polish musicologist Danuta Gwizdalanka, the Polish Jewish Soviet composer Mieczysław Weinberg was himself a passenger, an unwilling passenger, of course, always on the run from the Nazi terror. He suffered the fate of a double persecution. In September 1939, Poland was attacked and Weinberg fled to Minsk. At that time, he was just 20 years old. And during the escape, he witnessed terrible murders and also his family died. They lost their lives in a concentration camp. And then Germany attacked the Soviet Union and Weinberg had to flee again. Kind of thanks to his poor health, he was not drafted into the army. This time, he fled to Tashkent, the capital city of Uzbekistan. And there he not only met his future wife and found employment as a repetiteur, he also met Dmitri Shostakovich and soon moved also to Moscow. And thanks to Shostakovich, Weinberg became aware of Pozmich's novel Pasacherka and turned the book into an opera, and that was in 1968. So we now have two examples of two different peoples who had to experience the war and its horrors. And in this context, I would like to emphasize three terms which, in my opinion, play a very central role in the topic of my presentation. Silence, so people can't or do not want to talk about the horrors. Oblivion, so the past kind of falls into oblivion, or somebody wants to suppress a memory. And remembering. So the author Pozmich, who at first did not want to talk about it, he managed to break through the wall of silence and to assimilate her experiences in the form of an autobiographical novel, Pasacherka. And Weinberg also found a way to deal with the horrors of the war and break the silence with music. And in 1969, he addressed the following words to his Polish friends. Many of my works are like a direct expression of gratitude to fate for being alive. And like all survivors, I consider it my duty not to forget the past. And I was looking for the right material to follow Éluard. He refers to Paul Éluard, who was a French poet, to say, if the echoes of your voices die, then we will perish. It seemed to me that the story of Sophia Pozmich, the passenger, wherein she passionately rejected the idea of the indulgence of fascist crimes, could serve as such material. Weinberg himself never got to see his opera on stage, and shortly after he finished his work, they promised him to perform it at the Bolshoi Theater, but then they told him that it would not fit into the repertoire, even though the work was great. So the real reason why the opera had to wait such a long time until its premiere was the anti-Semitic attitude of the government of the Soviet Union and, of course, also the content of the opera. At the time, the government was really interested in supporting local artists, and the promotion of immigrant artists with Polish Jewish backgrounds was therefore not a high priority. Furthermore, Daniel Elphig explained that in his monograph, Music Behind the Iron Curtain, that the Soviet authorities saw the commemoration of the tragedy of the Holocaust as an act of neglection, the neglection of the even larger number of Soviet citizens who died during the war. And the denial of some of the atrocities carried out on Soviet soil also played a big part in this obviously propagandistic interpretation. The Soviet state suppressed the performance for a long time, and in 2006 it was premiered in a concertone performance in Moscow, and 4 years later, 2010, it was also premiered in Bregenz in Austria, and finally also with a scenery and so on. The Prague Philharmonic Choir also participated in this performance. The author Pozmich was also part of the audience, and she gave numerous interviews and revealed interesting details about her time in the concentration camp Auschwitz afterwards. Unfortunately, she just passed away recently this year on the 8th of August. So now I want to show you selected key scenes of the opera and how Weinberg portrayed them acoustically. And for this reason, I have brought video excerpts from the production of the opera Graz into 2020, which I also saw live and which touched me really much. And my first example is an excerpt of a scene from the first act. It takes place on the ship in the 1950s and 60s, and the main character, Lise and Walter, remembered the good times and beginnings of their relationship, but suddenly a strange passenger appears, and Lise believes she's Martyr, a former concentration camp prisoner. So as for the staging, I think the scene is very well designed. The older woman walking around can be seen as Lise in the future. After all the time, she will still think of the horrors of the past, and it's a silent role which mostly expresses Lise's emotions. The passenger also appears several times, and I interpret the presented images in such a way that from this point on, Martha constantly appears in Lise's memories, and the horrors of the past become part of the present. And the stage set is quite sparse, the mood eerie and cold. So what happens here acoustically? Weinberg uses quite few sounds, only one interval, a fifth, and which get repeated quite often. To me, it sounds like a pendulum clock which is swinging back and forth, counting the seconds. And Lise can't take her eyes off the supposed martyr. Perhaps she also doesn't want to believe that it could really be her. In the music, Weinberg might already announces that the time has come now for Lise to face her past. And the additional deep chords and sounds threatening, and Walter does not know what's going on. At some points, Weinberg's music sounds like film music, and indeed already in his childhood and youth, the composer earned his money as a pianist and improviser for silent films. In this scene, he has succeeded in composing music that creates an oppressive atmosphere and which is full of tension at the same time. In general, Weinberg uses a lot of motifs in the opera which, similar to the leitmotif technique in films, for instance, represent the thoughts of the main characters and what is going on inside them. Also characteristic of Weinberg's music in the opera is the blending of tonal melodies with the 12-tone technique and some jazz accords. And the dissonant sounds are used for particular expressive moments. We will see this then in the next example. Lise has already told Walter about her Nazi past, and now she's trying to justify herself to him. I was not involved in the atrocities of Auschwitz. I never hit anyone are the central sentences of the scene. And the stage set, also in the stage set, the present and the past are mixed. In the background, one can see the concentration camp inmates who have just had to take off their clothes. And also visible is Lise as a guard in the concentration camp uniform and martyr in the glass case. This stands for the gas chambers. And the staging literally shows us the images in Lise's head, her distorted memories. Let's listen which sounds Weinberg created for Auschwitz. Yes, according to Sophia Pozmich, the concentration camp guard who actually existed never became violent in her present. However, this did not make her less dangerous. In the libretto of the opera, it's written that one should be especially careful because she would not kill by herself, but at the hands of others. What happened to her, however, is not known. Pozmich closely followed the trials of the Nazi perpetrators after the war, but the name of Annalisa Franz never appeared anywhere. At the very beginning of the scene, we heard a striking motif. Maria Pregatna, musicologist, calls it the justification motif. It is played by horns, timpani, and double basses, and the timpani and double basses play on the first and fourth 8 notes, and the horns play on the second, third, and fourth. And in my opinion, this acoustically represents beats. And this has a very interesting effect, I think, in combination with the text, since she claims that she did not hit or beat anyone. Sometimes it appears in combination with the Auschwitz theme, as it was in this case. It is played by flutes, clarinets, oboes, bassoons, and trombones. It sounds very shrill, and the semitone steps in 16th notes are quite striking. Also, the high shrill dissonances clearly bring out musically the atrocities that took place at Auschwitz. And then suddenly, the justification motif shows up again as soon as Walter demands that Lee should continue to speak about her past. For the last example, I would like to show you a part of the climax of the opera. Tadeusz is dragged before the commandant to provide him with his favorite waltz music. In the background, we see people lying there. They represent the victims of the concentration camp and the fate that awaits Tadeusz after the concert. Instead of the waltz, Tadeusz plays the chaconne from Bach's Partita for Violin No. 2, making a musical protest. At the beginning, the melody is played by a single violin, and gradually all the strings join in. Tadeusz seals his own fate, his violin being smashed, and he's dragged off to death. For reasons of time, I have shortened the scene so that the other instruments intervene in the melody and destroy it musically quite soon. So in terms of staging, the director has clearly given the stage to the music of Weinberg. It is a freeze frame. At first, only Lee's moves. The violinist and the SS men are frozen too, and only later they intervene. And I want to highlight that this happens after the music has already announced the intervention beforehand. The delicate music gets destroyed little by little with dissonant sounds. Here you see it, and it's really interesting that they choose the music of a German composer, Bach. David Fanning claims that Tadeusz kind of hurls a piece of German culture straight to the SS men. At the very end, the wind instruments also end with a very high note, and this tone can stand for the last breath, the dying, the moment when the tender, shimmering, bright soul kind of leaves the human body, maybe. So it is possible that opera serve as a media of remembrance. Kirsten Sicking, who examined the performances of Holocaust compositions and the culture of remembrance, says yes, they can. They raise the awareness and the reinterpretation of existing knowledge. And Holocaust compositions influence memories and interpretations of the past, and that's why they also kind of influence the present. The long ban on the performances of the opera already shows that the subject of the opera is very politically, and furthermore, it shows the power of the regime of the Soviet Union after 1986. So the performance history alone can be seen as a political message. Weinberg himself also sends a strong message with the content of his opera. The horrors of the past should never be repeated, and we should not look away and break the silence. Pozmich had the same opinion in 2020. At the very end of the performance in the opera Graz, the following words were visible for the whole audience on a big screen in absolute darkness. For a long time, I refused to believe that there was a language to describe what happened at that time. But over the years, I became convinced that we've got to speak out. We must never forget. Thank you for your kind attention.